The frost-covered hillside yielded its secret one slow inch at a time, as investigators knelt over a partially unearthed item that did not belong to the landscape. Buried beneath winter-hardened soil and brittle pine needles lay a single bracelet, its metal dulled by time yet unmistakably human in origin, and the surrounding stillness tightened into a silence that carried the full weight of something long hidden but never forgotten. The cold air around the dig site thickened, with the dawning realization that this tiny object, recovered by chance during a December search sweep, marked the beginning of a truth buried for decades and now demanding to be told. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Long before that bracelet resurfaced in the winter of 1980, the city of San Jose was already immersed in the holiday rhythm familiar to California's Santa Clara Valley. Christmas lights glowed along East Santa Clara Street, shoppers moved in steady lines near the Old Valley Fair Mall, and the promise of a mild West Coast winter carried through the foothills. Yet beneath the outward calm, those same months would become the backdrop for one of the region's most perplexing missing person cases. The victim, a 22-year-old woman named Rebecca Dane, disappeared during the week of Thanksgiving, a time when most families prepared for gatherings, football games, and seasonal traditions. Her absence created fissures of worry that widened into fear, and what began as a routine missing person report slowly evolved into a long unsolved case that would haunt detectives, family members, and the community through many holiday seasons. Rebecca was known for her quiet determination. She attended San Jose State University, worked part-time at a local stationery shop, and often volunteered during holiday charity drives. Those who knew her later described her as someone who made deliberate plans, seldom canceled commitments, and maintained a predictable schedule that allowed her to balance school, work, and home life. When she failed to arrive at her family's modest house near Alum Rock on the evening before Thanksgiving, concern rose quickly. Calls went unanswered, her bicycle remained parked outside her apartment complex, and coworkers confirmed she had left her shift early to prepare for the holiday weekend. The missing person report was filed well before sunrise. When officers from the San Jose Police Department first opened the case file, they noted normal risk factors associated with disappearances of young adults, but found no signs suggesting voluntary flight. There were no abrupt withdrawals from her bank account, no disagreements at work, no evident relationship turmoil, and no medical issues that might have explained sudden disorientation or escape. The initial canvass relied heavily on the season's heightened foot traffic as investigators circulated flyers around downtown corridors, university halls, small shops, bus terminals, and community boards crowded with announcements for holiday drives and December events. The widespread distribution succeeded in drawing community attention, but despite the visibility and the season's bustle, no reliable tips emerged. In the first week of December, detectives reviewed Rebecca's routine once more, searching for environments where she might have been vulnerable. Her bike commute from the store took her through downtown before veering east toward her apartment. She often passed construction corridors lined with temporary fencing, areas dimly lit during winter evenings. Although the city was not considered unusually dangerous, property crime and opportunistic offenses had increased that year. Still, officers found no abandoned belongings, no signs of a struggle, and no witnesses reporting suspicious activity along her route. Through the following days, the case remained active but stagnant. Officers performed holiday season checkpoints, interviewed bus drivers, reviewed student union logs, and contacted surrounding jurisdictions. The press published short columns describing her disappearance, usually near stories advertising Christmas parades or rising seasonal retail traffic. The community responded with donations for continued searches, but diminishing leads strained morale. The holiday season progressed toward Christmas Eve, and Rebecca's family, who had decorated their porch with modest lights in hope rather than celebration, clung to the possibility of her return. Despite the lack of evidence, detectives insisted on maintaining steady procedural work. They examined her academic notes, workplace logs, and library checkouts. A library loan record showed she had borrowed a geology field guide days before her disappearance, but investigators later determined it was unrelated to any suspicious behavior. Her roommate provided information about Rebecca's habits and noted she often wore a particular bracelet, silver, slightly worn, with a small clasp that had once belonged to her mother. It was sentimental, and she rarely removed it. Investigators recorded the detail, though at the time it seemed unlikely to play any significant role in the case. As December advanced, the search perimeter widened beyond urban centers into the rural edges of Santa Clara County. Hillsides north of Mount Hamilton were surveyed. Drainage ditches along U.S. Route 101 were inspected, and volunteers combed the periphery of Alum Rock Park. Winter in the region brought cooler temperatures but not heavy snowfall, allowing teams to move through rugged areas without seasonal obstruction. Even so, the absence of clues during these early searches weighed heavily on everyone involved. The case seemed destined to join a growing archive of unresolved missing person files. By early January, attention shifted as New Year's festivities concluded, and the holiday atmosphere dissolved. Rebecca's case became one of several under review during departmental briefings. Detectives reassigned to fresh investigations still referenced her file regularly, unwilling to let it fade into bureaucratic stagnation. Her family continued to distribute flyers, some of which remained pinned to bulletin boards in grocery stores and laundromats long after the decorations came down. Through winter and into spring, the absence of new leads created a quiet ache that settled over every attempt to revisit the timeline. What ultimately broke the silence came from an unexpected angle. During the second week of December the following year, nearly 12 months after Rebecca first vanished, a small group of local hikers reported finding what appeared to be personal jewelry on a hillside. The holiday season had drawn more residents outdoors, and recent rainstorms had shifted soil along the lightly traveled trail. The bracelet, partially embedded in a shallow depression, matched the description provided months earlier by Rebecca's roommate. Detectives quickly secured the location, and forensic teams photographed the site, collected soil samples, and cataloged the recovered item. At first glance, the bracelet provided only a tenuous suggestion of a connection. Alone, it was not conclusive, yet its presence in a remote section of land east of the city elevated the stakes of the investigation. The hillside was not on any of Rebecca's known routes, nor was it near the bike path she had used daily. Detectives reviewed land maps, noting that the location bordered private property with a small, seldom-used service road. The land was dotted with scrub, brush, and intermittent pine clusters, creating natural concealment. The season's cold air preserved the area's integrity, and fallen needles layered the soil in ways that allowed forensic technicians to identify disturbances not easily visible throughout the year. In the days after the discovery, detectives revisited every interview, focusing particularly on individuals whose December statements contained inconsistencies. One name resurfaced: a maintenance contractor who had briefly worked near Rebecca's apartment complex during the fall months. Though initially unremarkable, his time records from that period included gaps explained by temporary job reassignments. His personnel file, obtained through standard inquiry, revealed prior complaints involving inappropriate behavior toward tenants, none prosecuted but well documented. The renewed interest in his profile triggered a deeper background evaluation, revealing a pattern that demanded further examination. While investigators pursued these leads, forensic specialists examined the bracelet. Microscopic organic traces adhered to the inner clasp, potentially preserved by its partial burial. Soil chemistry suggested movement rather than natural deposition. The geographic analysis team overlaid historical aerial images with topographic surveys, revealing that in late 1980, the area surrounding the hillside had been accessible via a temporary construction route used by contractors for nearby utility work. The maintenance employee in question had subcontracted seasonally for one of those companies. Detectives reconstructed the possible movements based on newly surfaced work logs. If the contractor had indeed traveled through that area, investigators needed to determine whether he had done so during the week of Thanksgiving. Timecard discrepancies aligned suspiciously with the days immediately after Rebecca's disappearance. Interagency cooperation expanded as records from the construction company were retrieved from storage facilities, providing archived dispatch logs, handwritten notes, and incomplete mileage reports from 1980. As winter settled over San Jose once more, the case gained renewed momentum. The bracelet, small and unassuming, became the fulcrum upon which the investigation pivoted. Every emerging detail suggested proximity between the suspect and the location where the jewelry had been discovered. The process was methodical, driven not by speculation, but by accumulating consistencies that narrowed the investigative path. Days were spent reviewing outdated microfilm reels, cross-referencing addresses, and re-examining witness statements that had seemed insignificant months earlier. Each new piece of information reinforced the growing possibility that Rebecca had encountered the contractor on the evening she disappeared. Whether by chance or through a situation escalating beyond her control, the proximity of his known work zones to her apartment and commute path established the first strong directional lead in a case long defined by absence. The hillside's geographic isolation hinted at deliberate travel by someone familiar with service roads, terrain patterns, and temporary access points. By the end of the year, investigators were prepared to reopen the case publicly, appealing once more to the community while quietly preparing next steps. Yet the decisive breakthrough still lay ahead, waiting in records that had not been examined in decades. The renewed attention inspired by the bracelet propelled detectives back into archived evidence rooms, where aging cardboard boxes held documents from the earliest days of the investigation. Dust-coated folders, brittle notepads, and faded photographs were arranged carefully across long tables, as investigators reconstructed the timeline from the moment Rebecca left work on the afternoon before Thanksgiving in 1980. Each entry in the logs, every uncertain witness impression from the early canvass, and all previously dismissed tips were reviewed in light of the recent hillside discovery. Through this comprehensive process, a subtle but crucial pattern began to materialize. The maintenance contractor, previously an unfocused figure in the background of the case, now appeared woven through several elements that investigators had initially treated as unrelated. In the original reports, there had been notes about a white service van seen near Rebecca's apartment on the evening she disappeared. At the time, maintenance and contractor vehicles were common in the area, and the sighting did not seem remarkable enough to pursue aggressively. Now, with the bracelet establishing a tangible point of connection, that earlier detail took on new significance. Detectives compared the descriptions from witnesses to vehicle logs obtained from the contractor's employer. Although the records were incomplete, They revealed that the contractor had indeed been assigned a white van during that period. Furthermore, mileage reports were inconsistent with work orders, indicating unaccounted travel that matched the window of time when Rebecca was last seen. The investigative team expanded its review to include county maintenance logs, local construction schedules, and private contractor dispatch slips. These records, many handwritten and stored without digital backup, proved difficult to interpret, yet detectives persisted, understanding that any confirmation tying the suspect to the Hillside area could reshape the case entirely. Mapping specialists created overlays illustrating potential routes the contractor might have used during late November 1980. Several plausible paths emerged, each intersecting with the rural service road that bordered the area where the bracelet had been found. The possibility that the suspect had chosen that isolated location out of familiarity strengthened the investigative direction. Attention turned next to forensic reanalysis. Over the decades, advances in laboratory technology had transformed techniques that were unavailable when the case first went cold. The bracelet underwent enhanced testing, including microscopic material comparison and chemical profiling. Analysts discovered faint traces of a specific soil blend unique to the northern slope of the hillside, confirming it had not simply been carried there by runoff or incidental movement. The composition included mineral fragments consistent with areas disturbed by construction equipment around the same period. Additional trace elements adhered to the inner clasp, preserved through decades of burial, hinted at contact with textile fibers that could not yet be definitively linked, but suggested the bracelet had been removed in circumstances inconsistent with simple loss. Parallel to the forensic work, detectives conducted a delayed background sweep on the contractor, now in his 60s. He had relocated to another part of California in the years following Rebecca's disappearance and had since retired. His employment history included numerous short-term maintenance positions, some with overlapping gaps that he attributed to seasonal layoffs. While he had no convictions, the pattern of complaints filed against him in the late 70s and early 80s reflected recurring concerns about inappropriate conduct in residential environments. These incident reports, though informal and largely unprosecuted at the time, provided enough behavioral context to warrant closer examination. Investigators proceeded with caution, aware that decades-old allegations alone could not justify direct confrontation. Instead, they focused on building a timeline supported by verifiable records. They located archived maintenance logs from the apartment complex where he had worked during the same month Rebecca disappeared. The entries confirmed he had been present in the vicinity on multiple days that aligned with her routine schedule. A set of handwritten notes suggested he had been assigned to inspect heating units ahead of the winter season, providing him legitimate access to several buildings along the route Rebecca frequently traveled. As detectives pieced together the fragmented documents, they also revisited previous witness statements from residents. One elderly tenant, interviewed during the initial canvass, had described a man lingering near the bicycle racks around the time Rebecca typically returned home. The detail had seemed unremarkable then, overshadowed by the absence of other confirming accounts. Now, with the composite profile of the suspect emerging, the description aligned closely with his appearance in employment photographs from that era. Given the age of the witness and the elapsed time since her original statement, investigators chose not to rely on memory, but on the consistency of the documentary record. In early December of the second investigatory year, detectives reached a turning point. The construction company that had employed the contractor part-time during 1980 responded to renewed requests for any remaining archived materials. Stored in a remote warehouse, a set of logbooks documented equipment access for temporary workers assigned to utility easement maintenance. One entry, dated the day after Thanksgiving, listed the contractor's name beside the notation East Ridge Transport Utility Check. The route recorded in those logs traveled within a short distance of the hillside where the bracelet had been discovered. The entry did not specify the purpose or duration of his trip, but its proximity to the search area aligned too closely to dismiss. Armed with these converging details, detectives conferred with departmental legal advisors to determine the threshold for obtaining search warrants. The absence of a confirmed body limited available charges, but new forensic findings, vehicle inconsistencies, and the logged utility route established probable cause for further inquiry. A warrant was secured to examine the contractor's remaining possessions, including a storage locker he had rented for decades. When law enforcement opened the unit, they found a mixture of tools, old uniforms, equipment manuals, and boxes containing personal items. The search team cataloged everything, prioritizing objects from the early 1980s. Inside one cardboard box, investigators discovered a zippered pouch filled with miscellaneous belongings. Among them was a faded paper receipt from a gas station on the east side of San Jose, timestamped on the evening of Rebecca's disappearance. The contractor had previously stated he had been home that night, preparing for the holiday weekend. The receipt contradicted his long-standing account and placed him in a location that connected directly to the suspected travel route toward the hillside. The discovery provided the first hard contradiction in his statements. Detectives analyzed a stack of additional receipts, vehicle maintenance slips, and handwritten notes. Several entries matched days when Rebecca's case records indicated her likely movements, deepening the possibility of undocumented contact between the two. While none of the items alone established guilt, together they painted a picture of proximity, opportunity, and deception across decades. With the corroborating documentary trail growing stronger, investigators returned to the hillside for a more extensive excavation. Winter rains softened the soil, allowing forensic archaeologists to conduct a structured dig in concentric layers. The search grid expanded gradually, and the team worked with methodical precision, documenting all disturbances. Within days, they uncovered a small set of fragmented remains beneath compacted earth and pine roots. Although the condition reflected the passage of time, forensic anthropologists identified characteristics consistent with a young, adult female. Dental comparison later confirmed the remains were those of Rebecca Dane, finally providing the long-sought physical resolution to her disappearance. The recovery shifted the investigation from a missing person inquiry to a homicide case. Autopsy specialists, working with the limitations inherent to decades-old remains, documented bone wear, environmental degradation, and subtle indicators that suggested the manner of death was unlikely to have been accidental. Though the exact cause could not be determined, the evidence supported the conclusion of foul play. The hillside, once merely a site of speculative interest, became the focal point of a fully reactivated criminal investigation, now strengthened by physical confirmation. Detectives prepared a comprehensive brief outlining all findings: the bracelet's forensic profile, the contractor's inconsistent statements, the utility route logs, the gas station receipt, the eyewitness descriptions, and the geographic overlap between his known movements and the burial location. They presented the material to the district attorney's office, which initiated a detailed review to determine the viability of charges despite the age of the case. Prosecutors noted that while the case lacked modern DNA-level certainty, its circumstantial foundation was exceptionally strong. Legal precedent in California supported the pursuit of homicide charges where long-term concealment, documented inconsistencies, and corroborating evidence demonstrated clear involvement. The contractor's proximity to the victim, his conflicting accounts, and the forensic linkage between his work routes and the burial site collectively met the threshold for prosecution. Before proceeding with an arrest, investigators conducted a final interview with the contractor, approaching him with the emergence of multiple evidentiary lines. The conversation, though not confrontational, marked the first time he faced the full scope of the modern case reconstruction. His responses were evasive, shifting details in ways that conflicted with earlier statements. He acknowledged traveling near the Hillside area during the period in question, but denied any knowledge of the bracelet or Rebecca's disappearance. These inconsistent explanations further reinforced the investigative findings. Following the interview, prosecutors authorized an arrest warrant. After decades of silence, the winter morning when officers approached his residence marked a defining moment in a case that had once seemed beyond resolution. He was taken into custody without incident and charged with homicide, with additional counts related to long-term concealment of remains. Preparations for trial began quickly, though the process unfolded with deliberate legal care. The case had to be presented in a way that allowed jurors to understand the historical context, the seasonal environment of late 1980, the investigative limitations of the era, and the modern evidentiary breakthroughs that collectively established responsibility. Detectives, forensic analysts, historians specializing in archival procedures, and expert witnesses in soil science and geographic analysis were all summoned to prepare detailed reports. But even as prosecutors built their argument, one final piece of evidence awaited discovery, one that would ultimately bridge the remaining gaps between circumstantial inference and clear factual linkage. It came not from storage bins or hillside excavations, but from an overlooked municipal archive. The overlooked municipal archive had remained untouched for decades, preserved more by chance than by design. Deep within the city's records division, clerks unearthed a stack of property maintenance reports from late 1980 that had been relocated during an office move. The reports were yellowed, brittle at the edges, and stored among documents unrelated to criminal matters. When detectives reviewed the collection, they immediately noticed entries from the month of November, including one referencing a maintenance call near the apartment complex where Rebecca lived. The form included a brief notation: report of broken exterior light, east walkway, resolved by contractor. The name listed for the job completion matched the suspect. The detail might have seemed insignificant on its own, but the timestamp placed him at the complex on a day when Rebecca's schedule indicated she would have passed through the area on her commute. The walkway light had been one of the fixtures responsible for illuminating the path near the bicycle racks. According to the handwritten note at the bottom of the form, the repair involved deactivating the circuit for a short period, potentially darkening the route. Investigators were careful not to draw unfounded conclusions, but the proximity of the repair to the time of her disappearance reinforced the growing pattern. A series of overlapping events situating the contractor consistently near Rebecca's daily movements. Mapping specialists revisited the lighting schematic for the complex as it would have existed in 1980. Their reconstruction drew on archived blueprints and utility layouts. What emerged was a clearer picture of an environment that, during the brief outage required for repair, would have been unusually dim. The combination of seasonal early sunsets, Thanksgiving travel distractions, and temporary darkness created conditions under which someone familiar with the grounds might have observed or approached a resident without detection. While this finding did not establish causality, it strengthened the prosecution's narrative about opportunity. Meanwhile, forensic analysts continued work on artifacts recovered from the contractor's storage unit. Among the tools and personal effects, they found a collection of work gloves, some from the early 1980s. Although any biological traces were long degraded, the gloves retained embedded soil consistent with the hillside's unique composition. The match was not precise enough to be definitive, but the soil mixture's unusual mineral pattern provided yet another subtle link between the contractor and the burial site. Prosecutors viewed the correlation as reinforcing the broader mosaic of evidence. The district attorney's team dedicated months to building a timeline that jurors could follow without becoming overwhelmed by the case's historical complexity. They knew that the long intervals between discoveries demanded careful explanation. When the trial began, it unfolded in a quiet Santa Clara County courtroom, whose atmosphere contrasted sharply with the gravity of a case spanning more than 40 years. Local newspapers covered the proceedings with reserved attention, framing the trial as a rare moment when cold casework intersected with modern forensic persistence. The demographic reading audience, many now older than the victim had ever been allowed to become, understood the importance of closure for a case rooted in their region's collective memory. The prosecution began with foundational context, outlining the original disappearance and the extensive search efforts undertaken during the winter of 1980. Witness accounts, workplace logs, and Rebecca's established routines provided a framework for understanding her vulnerability during the holiday season. The lost bracelet and its eventual discovery on the hillside became the central narrative pivot. Forensic experts explained the soil adhesion, the trace materials, and the conditions under which metal jewelry could remain preserved across decades. Their testimony was measured, grounded in scientific reasoning rather than dramatic rhetoric. Next came the archival evidence. The newly uncovered maintenance report, the gas station receipt, the contractor's incomplete mileage logs, and the construction company's handwritten dispatch records were presented not as isolated anomalies, but as parts of a converging timeline. Prosecutors emphasized the consistent overlap between the suspect's documented movements and the locations relevant to Rebecca's disappearance. The defense responded by suggesting that the records, though real, did not conclusively demonstrate criminal involvement. They pointed to the imperfect nature of decades-old documentation and argued that proximity alone could not establish intent. Yet it was the contractor's own statements, those given both in 1980 and during the renewed investigation, that undermined his defense. The prosecution highlighted discrepancies in his account. His initial denial of traveling near the hillside contrasted with admission during the later interview that he may have passed through the area. His assertion of being home the night of the disappearance contradicted by the gas station receipt, and his recollection of maintenance routines misaligned with the lighting repair logs. Each inconsistency cast doubt on his credibility and strengthened the prosecution's argument for deliberate deception. The anthropological testimony regarding the remains provided sober clarity to the courtroom. Although the experts could not determine the exact cause of death, they affirmed that the burial location, depth, and soil compaction patterns were inconsistent with accidental discovery or natural processes. The burial appeared intentional, executed by someone with access to the service road and the familiarity to navigate the landscape without attracting attention. Combined with the contractor's documented presence along nearby work routes, The burial evidence anchored the prosecution's case in physical geography rather than speculation. As winter progressed, the trial moved through additional layers of testimony. A retired apartment manager described the contractor's employment history and confirmed he had been assigned exterior lighting tasks. Several former coworkers recounted general behaviors, noting his tendency to take unofficial detours while using company vehicles. Even though none could directly tie him to Rebecca, their accounts established a pattern of unlogged movement consistent with mileage irregularities documented in the records. The defense attempted to counter by suggesting alternative explanations for the bracelet's location. They argued that hikers, storms, or unrelated passers-by might have deposited it on the hillside. They challenged the reliability of the forensic soil comparison, citing environmental changes over 40 years. They emphasized the absence of modern DNA evidence and warned jurors against relying on circumstantial inferences. Their strategy focused on creating doubt about whether the convergence of records and reconstructed patterns truly established guilt. But the cumulative weight of the evidence proved difficult to dismiss. The prosecution introduced weather reports from the week of the disappearance, showing stable conditions that made accidental travel to the hillside unlikely. They presented expert testimony indicating that the mineral signatures in the soil on the bracelet matched deeper, layers specific to disturbed ground, suggesting that the bracelet had been buried with the remains rather than scattered later. They further demonstrated that the contractor's access to both the apartment grounds and the service road gave him unique opportunity that no other identified individual shared. Late in the trial, another critical element emerged from the municipal archive. Among a set of outdated radio dispatch logs, technicians located a recorded summary from a utility supervisor noting that a service vehicle had been unaccountably overdue on the night following Thanksgiving 1980. The vehicle number matched the white van assigned to the contractor. The summary indicated the van's odometer reading upon return exceeded what would have been expected based on its assigned tasks. Though the supervisor's comment had not been flagged at the time, the entry aligned precisely with the forensic route reconstruction developed in the present day. Prosecutors introduced the dispatch summary as corroboration of unauthorized travel. The defense objected, citing the age of the record and the potential for clerical error, but the judge allowed it, acknowledging its relevance within the broader evidentiary framework. This dispatch log, combined with the gas station receipt and construction route entries, created a triangulated map of movement that placed the contractor near the hillside within a narrow window following the disappearance. As the trial neared conclusion, both sides delivered closing arguments reflective of the case's complex temporal layers. The prosecution emphasized the strength of the converging timelines, the forensic consistency, and the documented absence of any innocent explanation for the contractor's movements and conflicting statements. They highlighted the significance of the bracelet, the only personal item of Rebecca's ever recovered intact, and its role in guiding investigators back to the place where her remains were ultimately located. Their narrative centered on methodical reconstruction rather than emotional appeal. The defense reiterated that the case lacked direct scientific proof tying the contractor to the crime. They suggested that memory, records, and physical evidence spanning 40 years could not meet the threshold of certainty required for a homicide conviction. They asked jurors to consider whether coincidence, rather than intent, might explain the accumulation of unrelated details. The jury deliberated for several days, reviewing documents, expert testimony, and the reconstructed timeline. The demographic makeup included several older citizens who had lived in the region during the early 1980s and remembered the disappearance. Though instructed to disregard personal recollections, their careful attention to the presented evidence reflected a sober understanding of the case's significance. When the verdict finally arrived, the courtroom remained almost entirely silent. The jury found the contractor guilty of homicide and guilty of concealment of human remains. The verdict, grounded in decades of work, represented the culmination of persistence, forensic advancement, and procedural rigor rather than dramatic revelation. The sentencing phase followed quietly, with the judge acknowledging the profound delay in justice, but also the extraordinary diligence that allowed resolution. The contractor received a lengthy prison sentence, reflective of the severity of the crime and the years of unanswered questions endured by Rebecca's family. He offered no statement, maintaining the subdued demeanor he had displayed throughout the trial. With the legal proceedings complete, the investigation's lingering administrative work began. Detectives finalized reports, archived digital reconstructions, and ensured that all materials were transferred to long-term storage. For many involved, especially those who had inherited the case after retirement of previous generations, the resolution marked a rare moment when cold casework intersected with closure. Outside the courthouse, winter settled again over San Jose. The hills where the bracelet had been found were quiet, shaped by seasonal winds that carried the scent of pine and earth across the ridge. For the community, the memories of the case lingered, subtle reminders etched into local history that even the smallest object, buried and forgotten, could one day bring truth back to the surface. Yet one final dimension of the aftermath remained to unfold, a phase of quiet recognition and reflection shaped not by the courtroom, but by the families and officials who had lived with the unanswered questions for so long. The closing chapter of the case would play out away from public scrutiny, in the quieter spaces where resolution does not always bring comfort, but allows history to settle into permanence. In the months following the verdict, the case shifted from an active prosecution into a long-delayed chapter of community memory. Officially, the investigation was closed, its files now complete with the final legal outcome and the placement of materials into permanent archives. Yet cold cases do not simply conclude when the courtroom doors close. They resonate through the personal histories of those who lived alongside their uncertainties, shaping quiet rituals, silent acknowledgments, and a sense of time divided between before discovery and after resolution. As winter passed over San Jose once more, those connected to the case, detectives, analysts, archivists, and above all Rebecca's family, moved through a period of reflection that carried its own subdued significance. The family's first act after the sentencing was to arrange a memorial service that acknowledged both the decades-long absence and the final return of Rebecca's remains. The service took place at a modest chapel on the outskirts of the city, near a line of eucalyptus trees that had stood through the same decades in which the investigation had unfolded. Attendees included relatives who had aged into new stages of life without the answers they had once hoped would come sooner. Some were now grandparents, others had moved away and returned only for this moment. They gathered not with the hope of closure, but with the understanding that recognition of truth, however delayed, remains essential to the grieving process. The service was small, private, and devoid of spectacle. A framed photograph of Rebecca, taken during her university years, stood near the altar. It had been displayed countless times in missing person flyers, newspaper clippings, and archived case files. Now it appeared in a new context, no longer signaling a search, but instead honoring a life reclaimed from uncertainty. Those attending spent time recalling her academic interests, her work at the stationery shop, her habit of volunteering during holiday seasons, the ways she had once woven herself into the community before abruptly vanishing into a case that would challenge investigators for decades. Meanwhile, within the San Jose Police Department, the case became an instructional model for new officers entering the investigative division. Training coordinators assembled the complete documentation: maps, soil analyses, archival discovery notes, trial testimony, excavation procedures, forensic reinterpretations, and interviews tracing 40 years of layered work. They emphasized how small details, once overlooked or undervalued, could gain significance through the passage of time and advances in forensic science. The bracelet, initially recorded as little more than a sentimental item once worn by a college student, became a central example of how evidence may evolve in relevance as investigative techniques expand. Detectives who had worked the later phases of the case often remarked on the unusual durability of its paper trail. The city's archival misplacement of maintenance reports, the construction company's long-forgotten logbooks, the utility dispatch records preserved by happenstance, all bore testament to the unpredictable nature of historical documentation. The case illustrated how municipal records, stored without expectation of future legal significance, could decades later form critical components in reconstructing events. Investigators credited the longevity of these documents less to deliberate preservation practices and more to institutional inertia, accidents of storage, and the eventual recognition that even the smallest administrative detail might one day contribute to solving a crime initially believed to lack evidentiary pathways. The forensic community also took note of the case. Specialists in soil science and trace material analysis incorporated the Hillside findings into lectures and professional symposiums. They highlighted how mineral profiles, deposition layers, and erosion patterns retained identifiable characteristics over long periods, even in regions with seasonal weather variation. The bracelet's survival served as an anchor point in these discussions, demonstrating how metallic artifacts embedded in soil can preserve microscopic evidence that withstands decades of environmental exposure. Analysts studying cold cases across the country cited the San Jose investigation as an example of how small-scale excavations, when guided by precise geological assessment, could redefine investigative direction. Within the legal community, prosecutors and defense attorneys dissected the trial transcripts to refine arguments surrounding historical evidence. The case provided a rare contemporary example of a homicide prosecution, relying heavily on circumstantial constructions rather than biological matches. Legal scholars examined the admissibility and weight of archival materials, the use of expert testimony to reconstruct historical environments, and the standards for evaluating credibility in statements given decades apart. These analyses helped shape discussions about how courts might approach similar cases in the future, particularly as technology continues to reshape expectations surrounding evidence that once seemed incomplete. Rebecca's family, for their part, approached the aftermath with the measured realism that accompanies any long-delayed resolution. They acknowledged that no verdict could compensate for decades of uncertainty or restore years lost to unanswered questions. Yet the identification of the burial site, the recovery of her remains, and the confirmation of what had happened allowed them to reclaim part of the narrative that had slipped beyond their reach for so long. They arranged for a modest gravesite, choosing a location with a view of distant foothills. Visitors left small tokens, seasonal flowers, handwritten notes, quiet symbols of remembrance. The grave became a place where family members could reflect not on the tragedy alone, but on the person who had existed before her disappearance. For law enforcement officials, the case reinforced the importance of long-term investigative discipline. The detective who wrote the final report noted that while forensic science played a crucial role, the breakthrough originated from simple persistence, repeated reviews of old files, re-examination of overlooked records, and the willingness to reopen leads that had once seemed unproductive. This reinforced a cultural shift within the department, encouraging investigators to revisit unresolved cases with fresh analytical frameworks. The San Jose case became a reference point for how patience, methodical organization, and renewed attention can converge to reveal details that earlier generations of detectives had not been equipped to fully interpret. Community members who remembered the original disappearance expressed relief mixed with solemn reflection. Some recalled the flyers distributed around grocery stores and laundromats, the brief newspaper articles that appeared during the early searches, and the seasonal backdrop that had framed the case. Those memories, softened by time, resurfaced as local media covered the trial's outcome. Residents noted how rare it was for a case from 1980 to receive such detailed reinvestigation, let alone reach a courtroom verdict decades later. For many, the final outcome served as a quiet reminder of the region's past, its evolving neighborhoods, and the changes in investigative capacity that had occurred since that time. The hillside where the bracelet had been discovered remained untouched following the excavation. Through the next winter, the landscape appeared much as it had before, windswept, marked by uneven clusters of pine, shaped by the gradual cycles of seasonal erosion. Authorities placed no marker there, choosing instead to preserve the environment without drawing public attention. The site existed quietly as a geographical point in the history of the case, significant not for its visibility, but for the role it played in revealing long-hidden truth. A few individuals associated with the investigation visited privately, walking the narrow trail where hikers had once made the discovery. For them, the place represented an intersection of chance, diligence, and the enduring potential for closure even in cases that initially defy resolution. In the final administrative phase, the San Jose Police Department prepared a comprehensive case summary for submission to national cold case databases. The document outlined each stage of the investigation, from the initial missing person report filed during the 1980 holiday season to the forensic advancements that enabled renewed work decades later. It included the chronology of evidence retrieval, the forensic significance of the bracelet, the identification of employment patterns, the reemergence of archival documents, and the legal justification for charges. The report was meticulous, reflecting a commitment to ensuring that the case would serve as both a resolved criminal matter and a resource for future investigations. As winter turned to early spring, a sense of measured completion settled into the narrative of the case. Those who had participated in the investigation understood that closure, in the context of cold casework, is rarely absolute. The loss remains. The unanswered dimensions linger. Yet truth carries its own form of restoration, even when it arrives long after those involved have aged into new chapters of their lives. The case had been shaped not by sudden breakthroughs but by steady accumulation, layers of documentation, fragments of soil, archived logs, reconstructed maps, and persistent inquiry that endured across generations of investigators. Many of the detectives now approaching retirement reflected with nuanced understanding on how the case had shaped their careers. They spoke of the responsibility inherent in revisiting unsolved files, the weight of working with families who had spent decades waiting for answers, and the delicate balance between hope and realism in long-term investigative work. The case reaffirmed for them the importance of comprehensive record-keeping, interdepartmental cooperation, and ongoing training in forensic developments. It also illustrated the unpredictable ways in which small discoveries, like a bracelet partially exposed by shifting soil, can alter the entire direction of an investigation. Rebecca's story settled into the community's collective memory not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to persistence and the slow, deliberate movement of justice. Her name joined the records of resolved cases maintained by regional databases, yet it also remained embedded in the quieter spaces of local remembrance. A plaque at the university garden where she once studied, a holiday charity drive held annually in her honor, and a brief mention in municipal newsletters recognizing the closure of long-standing investigations. The contractor, now serving his sentence, receded from public attention. His case file became part of a restricted archive accessible only to legal and investigative personnel. Reporters who had covered the trial gradually moved on to more contemporary issues, and the story faded from headlines. Within the prison system, he remained an unremarkable figure, defined not by notoriety but by the weight of documented evidence that had accumulated against him. His appeals, limited in scope, progressed through the court system without altering the outcome. Years later, new generations of officers reviewing the San Jose archives would encounter the case as a structured narrative. A disappearance during the holiday season, a long period of uncertainty, the discovery of a single piece of jewelry on a winter hillside, and the eventual unraveling of truth through meticulous forensic and archival reconstruction. They would study the maps, examine the soil records, and read the testimonies that had brought resolution. For them, the case would stand as an example of how law enforcement bridges past and present, connecting historical fragments to modern scrutiny. In the broader framework of cold case methodology, the resolution underscored a central principle. Time, while capable of obscuring evidence, also allows for new tools, new interpretations, and new opportunities to re-examine what once seemed immutable. The San Jose case demonstrated how persistence, combined with evolving forensic capabilities, can illuminate truths that appear inaccessible during earlier investigative eras. It reaffirmed that even in cases where initial searches yield little, the possibility of future discovery remains. As the final administrative entries were completed and archived, the story of the case, its uncertainties, breakthroughs, and ultimate resolution, settled into the historical record. It became part of the city's quieter narrative, reflective of the ways in which communities carry the memory of both tragedy and resolution through time. Winter returned each year, passing over the hillside, the courthouse, the university campus, and the neighborhoods where Rebecca once lived and studied. Those who remembered the case did so with a sense of solemn recognition, acknowledging both the enduring cost of loss and the measured achievement of truth finally brought into the light.